like to express very sincere thanks to the organizers of the conference. I couldn't be any more excited to be here and also honored to really be among such accomplished, well-researched thought leaders. So thank you all, and I look forward to learning from you all. So I was asked to, in 12 minutes or less, kind of try to get us all on the same page. What do we know, right, about sustainability and specifically the role of consumption in cities? So I'm going to try to do that in 3 points, all with 3 subpoints. My husband would say that this is a bit of a Debbie Downer presentation, but don't worry, I'm going to get you in a good place by the end. So here's what I have to say. So here's the overview of the 3 primary points. So the first is that dominant urban sustainability programs. Now, I'm talking here about technology-based, efficiency gain programs tend to prioritize ecological sustainability over social sustainability. We know this from a large body of empirical literature that's looked at sustainability programs on the ground and what happened. So that's the first point, and I'll have 3 subpoints. The second is that dominant sustainable consumption policy, which has focused on awareness-raising campaigns and nudges designed to push people voluntarily toward engagement on the market on an individual basis, have been ineffective. They haven't resulted in really measurable changes in consumer lifestyles. And the third thing that we know, and this comes from my anthropological background, so I'll tell you more about this in a minute, is that socially embedded exchange, so exchange in which people know each other, whether through gift economies, whether through sharing economies, whether through collaborative consumption, whatever we want to call it, can do 3 things. They can strengthen social capital and trust. They can regulate consumption through informal, normal mechanisms. And they can provide stability under uncertainty, which hopefully you all are starting to think about in relation to climate adaptation planning. Okay, so one by one. So the first point. So when we focus on ecological sustainability rather than social sustainability, or there's an imbalance there, as Helena alluded to, we can end up with communities that are already marginalized being even further marginalized. So a couple of examples. Varsha Patel has a great case study of New Delhi, where the movement to make a world-class Delhi resulted in a program to green the waterfront and also to modernize these traditional laundries called Dhobi Ghats. The idea was that they would bring in the most energy-efficient, water-efficient, mechanized laundry, and they would remove the people from the riverbanks, clean it up so it looked really nice to be a great park. Well, unfortunately, it resulted in significant increases in both water use and energy use. It also displaced more than 350 families, and it resulted in a loss of over 1,200 jobs. And that's just one program. In Austin, Texas, a colleague of mine, Elliot Treader, documented the movement during planning processes to revitalize an area of town in East Austin. And speculative real estate resulted in significant increases in property taxes. And you can see here in this chart, the red blocks are those who are tax delinquent. And unfortunately, in this neighborhood and the other neighborhoods that he studied, there was a very high correlation between those tax delinquencies and pensioners, retired people, elderly. Okay, second point. Technical or expert-based definitions associated with efficiency gains, technology improvements, they're very technocratic, right? And those definitions of sustainability are certainly important, particularly in cities, right, as we try to reduce our footprint. But they erase or hide other contesting notions of sustainability that come from the people, that are more ground up, or as Helena would talk about more social definitions of well-being or sustainability. So a couple of examples. Melissa Checker in New York City was working on post-Sandy Staten Island brownfields remediation. And she found that the remediation experts came in and decided that they would prioritize based on potential property value. So they would prioritize those places that they could get private developers to come in and clean up, rather than a very significant community-based effort to define those sites that needed to be cleaned up fast based on community-based observation. And ironically, what it ended up doing is further concentrating toxicity near African American neighborhoods and people of color. I know, isn't this horribly Debbie Downer? It'll get better. And one other example, Maria Carmen in Buenos Aires has a beautiful case study of just an amazing fight that was taken to the court between ecologists who were working for a nature preserve along the river and an ethnic group that had been squatting there for quite some time, long before there was any interest in making an ecological reserve, living there very sustainably, but based on very different notions of what is sustainable, right? So a very ecocentric vision of nature without people in it versus a very complementary strategy of people working together with nature, people thoroughly embedded in nature. I bet you can guess who won that one. Okay, and then the third point is that we do also know that sometimes sustainability programs that focus only on technological gain and ecological indicators can also result, this is not a unloaded observation, can also result in environmental injustices outside of city boundaries, right? So if we look at consumption-based emissions, so the emissions associated with all the things that people in cities buy, right? We see significant displaced emissions. So Gary McDonough's work in Hong Kong illustrates this. My work in Stockholm also illustrates this. So in 2009, the city of Stockholm released per capita CO2 emissions that were about 3.4 tons of CO2 equivalent per person in the city. When consumption-based emissions were accounted for, which I assume many of you know what that means, right? We're looking at the total impact of what people buy and purchase, regardless of where the emissions were released, right? That figure was at 15.8 tons of CO2 per capita. And when you look at those numbers relative to other suites, so across the country, we see that in the urban context, consumption-based emissions are almost 4 times what they are for the rest of, for the rural areas, right? So people in cities consume a lot, right? Our apartments may be more efficient and our transportation may be more efficient, but as long as people are consuming more and more, we get some significant, what we could call kind of displaced environmental loads or a metabolic rift. Okay, second point. So our kind of focus on consumption isn't working very well, okay? 3 reasons. One is that we've tended to focus on market-based mechanisms, asking individual consumers to make greener, better choices on the market. First problem, it's not a perfect market, right? There are time issues, certainly prices don't reflect the true costs of products, right? We don't have perfect information. That's a requisite to prevent market failures, right? There are all sorts of barriers associated with accessibility. Consumers who are aware, interested, engaged, but you know what? They do what we call licensing, where they play like a moral calculus. Oh, I've done this, so I'm not going to do this. We also find we have significant rebound effects. So even when people are aware, interested, engaged, they know and they take the behaviors that we ask them to take. Lots of studies now, a growing number of studies have showed that it sadly doesn't always result in objective environmental improvements. And the main reason why is because when we get highly, let's say for example, someone living in an apartment has the most efficient appliances. They have, maybe they even, like in Stockholm, they have district heating, they use the bus, they eat less meat, they do everything they're supposed to do. But those savings associated with efficiency gains result in higher incomes that are then reallocated most often toward consumer goods. So people buy more with those savings, right? And then the third thing is that these strategies are individualizing. This is a very hot research area right now. And I think that it's going to lead into a lot of the discussions that we'll have about sharing economies. At its very base, consumption is a social act. We may like to think that it isn't, right? That we make our own choices, and that may be a very American mentality based in, the kind of Horatio Alger individual competition model. But the reality is that we consume to signal belonging. We consume to signal our values. We consume to communicate difference as well. So consumption is a way of situating ourselves socially in a very complex society. And so as long as we continue to talk to people as if they can make choices that violate dominant social norms, we're going to continue to lose the battle. So that brings me to my third point. Thanks. So I'm an anthropologist, as Philip said, I'm an economic and ecological anthropologist. So I look at the nexus of humans through time and through space from an ecological and an economic point of view. Well, I'm teaching economic anthropology this term, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity to bring in some of the classic examples. So Malinowski, right, the famous guy that studied the Trobriand Islanders, who have this amazingly complex system of exchange where they get on these crazy boats and they go sail from island to island, and in one direction they exchange armbands, and in the other direction they exchange these shell necklaces. And this was published in the 1920s, but there's a whole body of literature that is built on this and built on this and built on this. And what we've learned is that these kind of gift-based exchanges, arm shells, necklaces, can create reciprocal ties of mutual obligation, so that people have partnerships, people upon whom they can rely for not only trading these kind of exotic items, but also the basis of what they need, right? So reciprocal relations of mutual support. We also know that when people trade with other people that they know, that we find institutions to regulate consumption. So there's the famous example of the potlatch. Oh, we're in the Northwest, so a lot of people probably know about the potlatch, right? Where instead of prestige being accumulated by, or prestige being associated with accumulation of material goods, prestige is then associated with the distribution of goods. And it also serves to tie communities together. So there's a real strong historical precedent here. And we also know from these works, but also from the works of many anthropologists and scholars who have looked at communities who have been in a very fragile relationship with the market. So maybe didn't always have access to markets, maybe didn't always have access, weren't sure if their crops were going to make it, right? When we have high levels of uncertainty and we have very differential access to markets, what we find is that these types of socially embedded economies really improve what most people would say, I don't like the word, but most people would call resilience, right? So they become adaptation strategies, right? And so in today's climate of uncertainty around climate adaptation, we can also think about this as really useful. So the conclusion is that cities, we can address sustainability, social sustainability, ecological sustainability, economic sustainability, and consumption by, yes, improving efficiencies. I don't think the literature anywhere shows that we don't need to improve efficiencies, absolutely. But we also need to raise awareness among consumers. We should absolutely keep raising awareness among consumers, that's a given. But we can and we should also work as best we can to foster already existing socially embedded economies where people know each other, where people, and this could be, again, resale, repair, reuse economies, this can be sharing economies, collaborative consumption, in order to foster social capital and trust and resiliency. So, that's it. Thanks, everybody.